Hello, Idre Peraza here, and today I'm going to be doing a different kind of video. I'm going to be going through 7 great albums that I think have been released in 2025. These are albums I personally rate higher than an 80 out of 100 or an 8 out of 10, depending on what scale you want to use. This video isn't going to be ranked, but instead I'm going to be talking about these albums in chronological order in the order that they were released this year. Because my opinions might shift over the course of the year, some of these albums might make the list, some of these albums might not make the list if they grow on me or shrink on me throughout the year. Without further ado, I want to get straight into this and talk about the first great album that was released this year, Mogwai's The Bad Fire. This is a post-rock album that is also categorized as being shoegaze, space rock, dream pop. But to me, it's a very, very experimental and interesting take on Mogwai's sound. It makes me want to get further into their catalog, since honestly, I feel like I haven't dived too deep into them. I've listened to Young Team quite a bit over the past few years, and I have listened to their album that came out before this. However, I do need to get much more familiar with this band's catalog. It's an extremely soothing album that is one of my favorites to come to this that has been released this year when I'm needing something to chill me out and calm me down while also needing an album that expresses high level of musicianship. Overall, Mogwai's The Band Bad Fire, I rate an 81 out of 100 or an 8.1 out of 10. I think it's a pretty great album. That was the first album released this year that really did stick out to me. The next album I'm going to talk about is the new Sharon Van Etten album, Sharon Van Etten and the Attachment Theory, which I would give an 83 out of 100. I've been a fan of Sharon Van Etten's music now for a few years. Are We There is probably my favorite album. I rate that album higher than a 90. I think that's a classic album of the 2010s. And I think that her songwriting skills and abilities and her vocal ability as well is really phenomenal and stands above a lot of people in the art pop and indie rock world in 2025 and the past few years. I think that Sharon's new album, The Attachment Theory, is one of her most spacious and new wavy inspired releases as well. I'm also not surprised that Marta Solagni is involved in the production on this record, since I'm very familiar with her work on Memento Mori by Depeche Mode, my personal favorite band. This is another great album in her catalog with, like I said, it has much more electronics. It reminds me of her album from a few years ago, which I'm blanking on the name right now, so please forgive me. But yeah, it's a more new wave inspired, indie rock inspired take on her sound compared to some of her more singer-songwriter material in the early 2010s. But I think a great album that I've come back to quite a bit this year. I would 100% recommend this record. Next album is actually like an EP slash compilation. I don't know what to really call it, but it is an ambient album from Tim Hecker, Shards. It's an ambient drone album with even some electroacoustic elements as well. I really think Tim never disappoints. As a big fan of ambient music, I really do think that Tim Hecker is one of the greats. I think that he rarely does produce music that's subpar. And because it's a relatively shorter release, I find this to be a very easily digestible piece of ambient music, and which actually says a lot because a lot of ambient music can be very lengthy, very long, and very hard for casual listeners to get into. My mind goes straight to my favorite ambient album of all time, Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, which is massive. I really don't even know off the top of my head how long it is, but it feels like it's like hours long. Great album. But this is like the opposite of that. It has a lot of atmosphere and texture that you're looking for in an ambient release, but in a much more concise package. I don't think it's Tim Hecker's greatest or most impressive work, but still a great ambient release. Probably the best one I've heard so far this year. I would rate this an 80 out of 100. Next up, we do have my current top album of the year right now, honestly. Jason Isbell's Foxes in the Snow. If you've been paying attention to my YouTube channel, you may have noticed I did a cover of the title track recently. But yeah, this album is amazing. I rate this an 88 out of 100. It's a singer-songwriter, Americana, contemporary folk album with some country elements as well. If you're and that shouldn't come to a surprise if you're familiar with any of Jason Isbell's work. But let me just say, I've been sort of familiar with his work. I never really listened to full albums of him until this album came out. And oh my god, this is for my first experience with Jason Isbell. I'm in love with his voice and this album. Lyrically, this is the best album I've heard this year. This is also one of the best purely acoustic Americana country style albums I have heard in quite some time. Like it's pretty much just him and an acoustic guitar. I genuinely have been having a lot of fun going through his back catalog now that I've been really into this album. And interestingly enough, even though this album came out the same day as Lady Gaga, whose album was much more electronic and pop oriented, this is the one that really hit me the most and impressed me the most, even though it has a more old fashioned style to it. It's a really emotional heavy hitter with a handful of great Americana songs that, like, this is Grammy worthy material in my opinion. Yeah, Jason Isbell's Foxes in the Snow is a fantastic singer-songwriter album with an Americana country folk tinge to it that I would recommend checking out if you're even remotely interested in those styles of music. I would also recommend some of his past albums, really any number of his past albums that have been relatively popular, as I've gone back and listened to those, and those are really fucking good as well. And a lot of those ones actually include more of a full band if you're into a more full sound. But if you want a stripped back acoustic album, this so far is the best I've heard in that style this year. Next up, we have Courting, and this album I'm just going to call Lust for Life because the full title is Lust for Life and How to Thread the Needle and Come Out the Other Side to Tell the Story. Yeah, I'm not going to refer to it like that every time. This gives me Bright Eyes vibes back when like albums like Lifted, which also have an extremely long title. Now this Courting album is actually a big return to form in my opinion because I actually think their last album was kind of a disappointment in my opinion. I thought the experimentation with the effects on the vocals and the general direction was kind of not that good. I thought it kind of was, there was a lot of growing pains on their last record. But honestly, they really pulled off well on this record. A lot of the elements that went wrong on their last album went right on this album, such as the use of auto-tune and effects on the voice. It's maintained and tamed much better on this record than it was on the last one. Beyond that, the writing on every track here surpasses even their solid debut album, and the overall punk or post-punk revival sound reminds me a lot of the group Block Party from the mid-2000s at certain points. It's one of the most consistent records I've heard this year, and it's very, very short. It's only like a half an hour or around that in length, and it's really nice to hear elements of music that I don't like that much, such as vocal overuse of effects on vocals, being used in a non-annoying and non-discouraging way as a listener. I don't know, it's hard to explain, but overall, like, I really did enjoy this record. It's an indie rock, post-punk revival, dance punk style record. If you're into any of those kind of genres, I think that this is actually one of the best I've heard from this group, if not the best album I've heard from this group. I rate this album an 85 out of 100. It truly is one of my favorite albums I've heard this year. Next up, we have Japanese Breakfast for Melancholy Brunettes and Sad Women. I am not a sad woman, but I still enjoy this album quite a bit. I rate this album an 81. If you're anything familiar with Japanese Breakfast, it's a little bit more on the tame side. It's a little more chill, a little less peppy and upbeat like how Jubilee was at certain points. But this is a more indie folk singer-songwriter record with some chamber pop influences as well, and honestly, I think it's a great follow-up to their last album. Like I said, it was much more mellow in nature compared to Jubilee, and slightly less engaging overall. But the production and soft performances in both the instrumentation and the vocals really make this a great listening experience. I'm not really sure quite else what to say about this record, but I do think that Japanese Breakfast continues to be one of the strongest acts in indie music right now, with her last album being very good and this album being quite great as well. Great enough to make this video. And then, last but not least, we have the most recent great album that has been released in 2025, and that is Perfume Genius Glory, which I rate an 86. This shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. I've been a fan of Perfume Genius for a very long time now. Not as long as my partner has, but for quite a few years now. I mean, I remember when Set My Heart on Fire immediately came out in 2020 with really my first exposure. So I've been a fan of his music for about 5 years now. And this, to me, is just yet another solid album in his catalog. It's much more acoustic-y and indie, I guess I would say, compared to his usual sound. But what even is his usual sound? Because his first two albums are more piano-based, ballad-based records, which I love. But then he then like very quickly started to expand into art pop and, you know, experimental music. And like if you want to go experimental, go listen to Ugly Season. Like that's a very experimental record. But then this is sort of not really a return to anything. It's a new ground. It's more indie folk, indie rock, even a bit ambient at some spots. Album of the Year even categorizes it a little bit as folktronica, which I mean that's debatable, but still, it's not wrong. Like this album is very adventurous while also maintaining, much like Japanese Breakfast, a very chill, mellow overall presentation and vibe. I have tickets to see Perfume Genius with my partner in June, and I'm really, really excited for that because I love his whole catalog, and I think that Glory is just yet another step into an ever-growing career that is moving in the right direction. I'm not worried about the future of Mike Hydreus musically at all. Like, he's moving in the right direction. He's a free artist is the best way I could describe him. A free artist that does what he wants to do without really anybody getting in his way. So yeah, those are the 7 albums that have been released so far in 2025 that have really stuck out to me. I'm not sure if any of these, I mean, that's a lie. Most of these are going to make it onto my end of year list whenever that time comes. But I'm curious how my thoughts on some of these albums are going to grow or shrink over the next few months. But yeah, currently Jason Isbell, Perfume Genius, and Courting are definitely ahead of the game, like are ahead of everybody else right now. Definitely in the lead. But all the other albums I mentioned are fantastic albums that should not be ignored. So far this year's off to a pretty solid start. We're only 3 months really in. So let's just hope for a good rest of the year. Maybe my album will end up on somebody's list. Probably not. But anyway, keep an eye out for new music from me. Keep an ear out for all the great music coming out in 2025. I have a good list that I'm really looking forward to. And probably in another 3 months or so, I'll make another video updating you with an updated list of some of the new albums that I did not cover because they haven't been released yet. So, with all that being said, goodbye. Thank you for tuning in. I'm going to try making more casual videos like this here and there on my YouTube channel to kind of get more engagement going so it's not all just music-based videos. I want some videos where I could talk about music because I love music and just do stuff like this. So thank you and goodbye.